Hold on, we got an echo here. Justin's on.
I'm here.
He's just going to put up his slides in a minute. Thank you all for joining us. Justin, you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Say it again.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, welcome everyone. We're going to start with an overview from Justin of a deck about PPP loan forgiveness, and we're going to talk about updates to the program, forgiveness questions, key aspects going on there, and then talk a little bit about what PPP 2.0 might look like. Hopefully, I know everyone's eager for it. And so without further, also one other thing is as we go, feel free to ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And we're going to have Rita here in the background and some other people organizing those so that we can address them better in the end. And I already have about 20 questions or so lined up for the end. But yeah, feel free to ask those and we'll get to them. So without further ado, go ahead, Justin.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me, Duncan. So I've got a deck prepared here, which I'll rely on a little bit here in the intro. One point I'm going to hit this disclaimer here real quick is that none of this is legal or financial advice. This is our interpretation of the guidance that's been put out by the SBA, and these are our kind of recommendations and interpretations, but are not legal advice in any way. So to give you a little background, this is Duncan and I. I'm the Senior Director of Finance at Fundera and have become very involved with the PPP program, specifically forgiveness, over the last few months. Duncan, do you want to do a little bit on you guys, or is everyone familiar with that?
Oh, sure, I'll do it. So I'm Duncan Downcorth. I got a haircut from the last slide.
Me too.
I'm the co-creator of COVID Loan Tracker. Rita does most of the work. I come on the webinars. No, I'm just kidding. But a little bit seriously. But anyway, so I think most of you know what we are, but those who joined new, who aren't familiar with us, we started off as a resource to help small businesses understand where PPP money was flowing. We've since transformed into basically an informational site that's helping small businesses navigate this whole pandemic mess, so to speak. So PPP, EIDL, forgiveness, other sources of funding. So that's what we're focusing on right now, and this partnership with Fundera and this webinar is part of us serving the community.
Awesome, thanks. So a little background on Fundera. So Fundera is a marketplace for small business financial solutions. We've been involved with PPP as an agent previously, and generally, most of our businesses focus on helping small businesses get debt funding through other, different types of loan products. We also, have a lot of content on various small business topics, and also review things like business credit cards, business bank accounts, and everything like that. So it's a kind of a natural partnership for COVID Loan Tracker and Fundera, and we're happy to do another webinar here. So I'm going to dive in, to this deck a little bit. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I think this will, be provided, but I do want to cover, start off with, some updates, and I think we'll definitely go into these a little bit more in depth later on. But, one kind of, I guess, here's the main kind of themes here, right? The program is currently closed. It closed August 8th after being extended, from where it was. It initially ended at the end of June and then was pushed to August 8th. The funds were not totally used up, and there are billions of dollars left in the program, but without a subsequent extension from Congress, it did expire on August 8th. Can small business owners apply for forgiveness yet? So on August 10th is when the SBA actually started accepting forgiveness applications. But one thing to point out here is that these have to go through your bank, something we'll cover a bit more later, but the SBA is not exactly accepting, your application that you fill out and send to them on the 10th, but they are accepting applications from banks. So all forgiveness still has to run through them. There was an updated forgiveness FAQ that was posted last Tuesday. There's been a few of these. I've incorporated that information in this deck, but there's been some subsequent guidance that's come out, about forgiveness as time has gone on, but there are still some outstanding questions. And then, another topic we'll dive into a little bit is what is PPP 2.0? What could that mean for, small business owners? How is that different maybe from PPP 1? These is all a little bit of speculation since the law hasn't been passed yet, but there have been some discussions. So, we'll try to cover that a little bit as well.
Hey, Justin,
So,
go into
yeah.
full screen mode, by the way.
Oh, sure. Of course. That's my mistake.
There we go.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Okay. So let's dive right in. So I'm going to hit on a couple more of those points that I covered in a little bit more detail here. So again,
we will be sending this around to everyone, by the way.
Yep.
So I know there's a lot of text in here, and that's so you guys can reference it.
Yep, exactly. So I'm going to try to go into a few more of those points in a little more detail and kind of set the stage for some of the questions and maybe what you and I talk about, Duncan, a little later on. And so the point of it, the SBA started accepting forgiveness applications on August 10th from the banks that dispersed these loans. From the information that I have of kind of talking to, Brennan being in emails or, discussions with some banks, there aren't, this isn't a thing where now all the banks who gave out PPP loans are submitting forgiveness applications to the SBA, and this is wide open. There are a lot of banks that are still, either designing their web application flow, waiting on further guidance on certain things, specifically a lot around sole props, or maybe are even dragging their feet to hope that a new law gets passed that simplifies forgiveness potentially. And so there, to my knowledge, this isn't a widespread opening of the forgiveness application. It's very much, some banks are doing it, a lot of others aren't, and it really depends on which one you went through to determine whether you can currently submit a forgiveness application or not. I do want to cover, while we're on that topic, I'm going to skip to the third point, which is that, there was a bill in Congress or various forms of a bill discussed, over the past few weeks. And part of this was, things related to both PPP forgiveness of the first round and then the potential for a new PPP program, which would give the option for a second loan. This hasn't been passed yet, and these negotiations look to be promising, but over the past 10 days or so, they've really slowed down it, and not really sure based on what I've read from the political commentary what is exactly going on here. But this has slowed down, mainly the two things that we're caring about around PPP, which is forgiveness going to be simplified? There were proposals that any loan $150,000 and under could be automatically forgiven, or some version of that. And then two, what a second PPP program would look like, which is there were things talked about like, well, you can get another loan if you demonstrate a certain percentage of revenue loss, comparing now to the beginning of the year or last year, and kind of those two pieces, the easier forgiveness for small borrower or small loan borrowers, and then a second round of funding are two big pieces that have now been held up as part of this larger negotiation, which is focused on things like postal service funding and unemployment benefits and stimulus checks to individuals. And so since that's all been wrapped up into one, we're kind of waiting on this big piece of legislation before we know anything further on those points. One more specific piece of guidance, the SBA has been releasing more frequent FAQs where they go through frequently asked questions. These are enormously helpful because they do many times present specific examples and are very helpful, I think, to some business owners who are trying to understand where they'll land in terms of forgiveness. I've listed on these three sub bullets here just some newer points that kind of came out of this that have been clarified recently. This third point is about what documentation you need to show if you weren't able to rehire someone. This point on interest on unsecured credit is not forgivable. You have to have it on real property, loans on real property, and then also this alternative payroll covered period only applies to payroll and doesn't apply to non-payroll expenses. These are all clarifications that have come out, and I encourage I encourage everyone to kind of take a read through this if you have very specific questions.
And Justin, are you going to cover the forgiveness timeline So not the 8 or 24-week period, but I mean like when people should start, how long they have, that sort of thing. Because I noticed you mentioned dates in here. I just wanted to clarify that.
In terms of how long they have to apply, or?
Well, yeah, because you have 10 months, right? So because the banks aren't necessarily opening it, I know there's some anxiety about when you're supposed to do this.
Right. So yeah, I'll just cover it now. I think might as well.
Okay.
So you can apply. One thing that's been clarified is the earliest you can apply is when you've used the funds that you were lent under your PPP loan. So you don't have to wait. That's if you're using a 24-week period. You know, if you've exhausted your funds at 16 weeks, you can go ahead and apply then. You know, obviously, if you did that before August 10th, that wasn't technically true, but now. If your bank also is accepting applications, you can apply as soon as your funds are, you know, kind of you've used them in your business on these forgivable, you know, categories. In terms of the, you know, end date of that, you know, if you apply, I guess, you know, you have to get a decision in 60 days, and you don't have to apply, like you said. There's the 10-month window, which you have to, I guess, which is not pay any interest on the loan. You can technically apply for forgiveness at any point during your PPP loan. It's just that you'll have already had to start paying the interest and principal back according to the loan itself. However, 10 months essentially from, I believe, the end of the year, so basically through October of next year, is when you can still, you know, have a window to apply and not have paid anything back on your loan yet. That being said, I feel like, you know, from my conversations, and I'm sure you probably are the same, a lot of people are, you know, anxious to try to get this done sooner rather than later, because the uncertainty around, is it going to get completely forgiven or not? And if it's not, then I'd like to know that, you know, sooner rather than later for planning purposes.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah, that's the same thing.
Yeah, no, that hasn't really changed. I think one clarification that happened several weeks ago, which I touched on, was just that you don't have to wait for the 24 weeks to be over to apply if you've exhausted your funds, which.
And I assume that the 10-month grace period for interest and principal repayment is part of the reason banks have been dragging their feet, because there's not like a big line in the sand that's immediate that they have to get this ready, right? And also they have that 60-day processing rule.
Right. So for first point, I definitely agree with. You know, they know that no one is going to be penalized with interest necessarily. It just creates more uncertainty, which stinks, but is not something that they're going to be, you know, on the hook for. And then the second point you said, you know, where, once they accept it and apply it, then that clock is ticking. And I think before they start that clock, which is partially on the SBA as well, but I think some of them are, you know, on one hand, they are also just trying to get these web experiences up in a way that they actually work. And to do that, they're trying to get as much guidance from the SBA and Treasury on specific questions. I know some of these bank, you know, lobbying or industry groups have, you know, asked questions to the SBA and said, you know, hey, we want to get answers on these things. And with the goal of, I think, having as much clarity as they can before they launch, you know, their experience online where you go apply. I have to guess that, you know, there is some benefit to potentially dragging your feet if then a law gets passed that basically eliminates forgiveness for 85% of the borrowers, by saying, like, if that, you know, what was proposed previously, where it's like any loan that's $150,000 in volume or lower, you know, you have a simple form and these are basically, you know, automatically forgiven. If I were a bank, you know, I'd want to know that before I started having these people submit for forgiveness, when it might turn out 3 weeks later they never needed to do that, or they could do so much more simply.
Exactly.
Okay. So I definitely think that there is probably some hopeful, you know, thought among some of these banks where they're like, man, if we can just, you know, kind of run out the clock until Congress passes something, then we can make this process a whole lot easier for everyone. And the banks are the ones very much pushing, or one of the parties pushing for that easier forgiveness, because they're kind of saying, you know, if you want us to participate in PPP 2.0, then you've got to help us with this giant logistical hurdle of processing, you know, millions of forgiveness apps. So you know, that I think would be one of the really positive thing if that were able to be passed. But anyway, I think that's kind of the reality of where we're at right now.
Okay.
So this is just, I have some links here in the presentation. These are the actual forms. Again, you can't submit these to the SBA. These are purely for, preparing yourself to submit to a bank. And, maybe there are some smaller banks, I imagine, where you basically can walk in and hand them this and they probably then forward it along. But you can't, as the borrower, send this straight to the SBA. But, we do have the various links here to the applications. Do you think, Duncan, that it's worth going into the basics of forgiveness, or do you think that the audience has a pretty good understanding of that and we could better elucidate that through questions, or what do you think?
No, I think we can focus on the updates primarily.
Yeah.
So I think it's been clarified, and then we can hit on more of it with questions.
Okay, I'm just going to do a brief run through here then and try to touch on anything that's come up. So one point I did raise was this covered period or alternative payroll covered period. One point is that you can align your payroll period with, or I guess when your expenses of payroll count to your payroll period if you do it every 2 weeks or more frequently, but you can't do that for all your other expenses. So that's one important point, I think, about how you think of these expenses fitting a period. Two of them, or you might have two different periods depending on whether you use the payroll cover alternate or regular.
So,
go ahead.
Other costs, non-payroll costs, have to fit. They have to be within an 8-week period. Is that what that means?
No, not 8 week, but they have to be when the loan is dispersed. The alternate payroll covered period says, if I want to,
your next payroll date is the starting one.
Right? Yeah, and initially it was kind of thought like that would move all of your expenses onto that time horizon, but it's not. It's just your payroll that you can shift. It's just to make it easier to fit the costs in. But the other expenses, now it's been clarified, these have to be just calendar from 24 weeks or 8 weeks from the day you got your loan.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Not a big deal. It just makes it slightly easier. This will go over again. There was a change here, in the Flexibility Act, which basically increased the threshold that self-employed individuals could basically replace their income, where before people were saying, oh, I got my loan based on 2.5 times my average monthly payroll, which means now if I actually am capped at this prior 8-week 15,000 amount, even if you were making 100,000, you couldn't even spend all of your loan on your payroll, even if that was your only expense. So subsequently they changed that and said, okay, now it's 2.5 months worth is the cap. So it's either the lower of whatever you made in 2019, 2.5 months worth of that, or if you were over 100K, the maximum you could possibly pay yourself is then 20,833. So that was a change back in June that was very much welcomed. Let's keep going through this. I don't think there's, okay, I do want to. Yep.
Can you cover that thing about unsecured credit that you hit on in the beginning, just in a bit more?
Yeah. So we'll talk about it here in reference to mortgage payments. You are allowed to pay interest on, a lease or a mortgage, where this is against what the SBA defines, and it was a common definition of real property, meaning it's a secured asset, essentially. Like a mortgage is a secured loan against a physical structure. And you are allowed to pay interest payments that occur during the covered period. You can't prepay interest and you can't pay principal. But what is specifically not allowed for forgiveness, you are allowed to spend the money on this, you just won't get it forgiven, is if you had something like a term loan. And this is an unsecured piece of debt that is just, you got maybe 50,000. Fundera actually facilitates these types of loans for small businesses. Mm-hmm. And while you're allowed to, there's no rule preventing you from spending the money on that, it was deemed not to be eligible for forgiveness.
I see. Okay.
So it's really, has to be, if you think of it, it has to be a secured loan. You can get forgiven on that interest, but you can't for unsecured debt. It's not my favorite rule. I think it's a bit punitive, and the people that generally have, unsecured lines, are no different than people that have mortgages. But I don't want to go on my soapbox too much here. One other thing I do want to cover is there's been a lot of talk about, the ways that which your forgiveness level could be reduced. And that's through, whether you reduced your full-time equivalent employees, or if you reduce salaries or wage rates, 25% or more. And those calculations are a bit complicated that I don't want to go to here, but I do want to point out one specific thing here. So there is a piece that was inserted in June in the Flexibility Act that, I quoted the legal guidance here directly, where basically says, you can get a safe harbor on this, meaning if I have less full-time employees now than compared to the reference period, but I was impacted by both direct or indirect compliance with COVID requirements or guidance, whether these are state or local or federal, that you can apply this safe harbor and essentially negate those negative consequences. So if you were a restaurant that had to close due to, Fundera is based in New York City, and this is still in effect in terms of at least indoor businesses, right? But restaurants were closed for a long time, and if you have less FTEs on average and you would otherwise be penalized, you would not. My interpretation is, it seems pretty clear, is that you would not be then docked for that essentially. This has a lot of impact on especially businesses that have physical locations where they do business.
We had questions about this in particular, that if you couldn't be open or you could only have outdoor seating, so you couldn't hire as many people back, are you penalized for that? So this is like a very good change.
Yeah, because I mean, it's just, it seems pretty fair. I mean, right, like if you only can operate half your space or 0% of your space, then the idea that you'd have to maintain your full-time equivalents is somewhat ludicrous. But that was kind of the case for a while, and now this guidance seems to make this a lot better. And so I would anticipate, I anticipate seeing a question about this, when you go to apply for forgiveness through your bank, but I'm not sure what documents will be required, or if it's based on, your business is located in X area, and it's similar to like an EIDL loan, where there's disaster areas are declared. If they'll do some sort of geography check there, it's unclear, but it is somewhat of a get out of jail free card for a lot of businesses.
Which might bring a useful piece of advice, which is if you're in that situation, it might be useful to try and print out a web page or save as a PDF any local orders about restaurants, because let's say you wait 6 months and those aren't around anymore, and it could become difficult to prove that situation. So it might be smart to be proactive and save any evidence of that at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a generally good guidance. I think, in terms of any documentation related to any part of PPP forgiveness is, be a hoarder in terms of documentation and try to get as much as you can and document everything. I think that goes also to another point that I want to hit on. Let me just find it. So there was another, people have asked a lot about, okay, well, maybe I didn't fall into that bucket, but, I've had times where, I've had to I've had to lay off people. I went to rehire them to restore my levels back to where they were, so I'm not penalized. And they, for whatever reason, maybe they were on the increased unemployment, or I couldn't hire them back for whatever reason, and I want to prove that I tried to do the right thing. I don't want to be penalized. And so there was this, question about, well, what kind of documentation do you need? And, the guidance that I've always kind of given in my interpretation of what would be best is, well, just try to document everything you can in writing. If you try to hire someone back and you have an email that says, I'm offering you your job back, and a response from them that says, no, thanks, I don't want this job. Like, to have those records saved, like you said, and ready to go for when this process happens, I think is really smart. This recent passage here, I paraphrased, is that if you're trying to do this, you need to, one, make sure you notify the state unemployment office within 30 days of the rehire offer. This is so that if the person is on unemployment, that could possibly count against them. The second is, they say you need things that the documents that the borrower should maintain include the written offer to rehire an individual, written record of the offer's rejection, and a written record of efforts to hire a similarly qualified individual. So essentially this kind of vindicated, or not, this isn't about vindication, but this idea of always trying to get written records of all these exchanges, because these are what's going to kind of prove as part of your application that you did the right thing and you couldn't meet these standards.
Might also be worthwhile to notify that employee that you're required to notify the unemployment office of the rejection of your offer.
I would say that is the humane thing to do, most definitely.
Yes.
This, I feel like, I'm not sure how well known this is, but it is something. This is, I think, a very close paraphrasing of what the latest SBA guidance was.
Okay, thanks.
So I think, there's a lot more you could go into the details, but I think it probably would best serve the audience to kind of let the questions bring out some topics, that are on people's minds.
All right, let me dig in here. So I'm going to start with, so the questions this week have been absolutely all over the place. A lot of them are specific questions that relate to some of the things we've covered, some speculative about what might happen in the next round.
Sure.
So let me just give me a second to analyze this and see where we should start.
You got it.
So there's one interesting question here, Justin. It was number 2 on our list.
Yep.
Talking about whether to use a 24-week or an 8-week period. And if they use the shorter period, would that allow additional unemployment benefits to be used in the remaining weeks? Do you understand what that question is asking?
Yeah, I've been asked this question in various forms before, and I've done a little bit of research on it, and I want to make clear here, I am not an unemployment lawyer, and this is not legal advice, but the way I understand it is, one, it seems pretty clear from the way the PPP forgiveness rules are written that you don't have to pay yourself or pay employees in terms of at least forgiveness. You may want to pay people on a normal schedule for various reasons, but you don't have to disperse your own income replacement out over a 24-week period in equal installments. It can be concentrated or, however you want to kind of do that. You could pay yourself a bonus, and that it seems to be very much allowed under the rules. And so I've been asked before this question about, okay, well, how can I kind of, do this to maximize my relief from the government? And it seems very much that you can't do both at the same time. If you are receiving a PPP benefit, I believe you're required to notify the unemployment office of that. But if you say got a 24-week or you got a PPP loan and you're 24 weeks, you have that period, but you pay yourself out all the money in 12 weeks. And then you could essentially say, okay, when I apply for forgiveness, I can either do it then, or maybe if then is now, and you can't apply yet, you obviously can't apply, but you could apply based on that period. Okay, so say that, my 12 weeks was ending, today, right? So this is the 18th. And on then next week, my bank opens up the application. I say, okay, I apply that, by the 18th, I'd exhausted all the funds, using my this shortened period. This is how it was allocated. I'm applying for forgiveness on this basis. And then as of, the 19th or something like that, then I have gone back to the unemployment office and gone back on unemployment benefits. That seems to be allowed. And as long as you're not doing both at the same time, from the research I've done, that seems to be a good way to, do things. But again, I want to really emphasize that I'm not an attorney, and this is just my interpretation of these things and how they interact. But I can say that I would advise people to not do both at the same time, and to the extent you can do one and then the other, usually I would think use your PPP and then go back on unemployment. That seems to be something that could be beneficial.
All right, thanks. And then I have 2 sort of higher level questions that were both hit on at various points by the audience that they wrote in. The first is, so I can say, as a PPP borrower myself and as someone who got an EIDL advance, one of the sort of high pressure situations I think a lot of people may be in is that the SBA keeps reaching out, trying to get me to finish my EIDL application, so to speak, and actually do a real EIDL loan, not just the advance. And so I get a phone call and or an email pretty much every week for the last few weeks. And so, and I know that one person asked this question, I know it applies to a lot of people, which is, if I need more loans, so to speak, at this moment, should I wait for a potential second PPP, or should I go ahead and do the EIDL now? So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about that, because I know a lot of people are in that position.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think the first thing I consider is that, you know, the grant itself, you know, is technically taken out of your forgiveness amount. And theoretically, if you had it before you applied for PPP, would have gone into the amount that you could receive, and kind of boosted it that way so that you'd add it to the balance and then pay it back as part of that. If you're looking for capital that's going to end up being a grant, then you can kind of roll the dice and wait on PPP 2.0 and hope that you fall in the criteria. And that very likely will end up being a grant and you won't have to pay it back. The EIDL loan you will have to pay back. Obviously, the terms aren't that, I mean, they're pretty good in terms of small business credit, but you will have to return that money. So it's kind of like, if, you know, it depends where you are right now. If you're sitting here and you say, I need this money to survive 3 weeks, then you should probably do the EIDL, because I don't think anyone knows when the next bill is going to get passed. And then you have to worry about, am I going to qualify under whatever restrictions they put in place?
Yeah.
But if you're in a better position and you want to be more opportunistic, then you could wait a few weeks, see what happens, and hope that you can get a, you know, that you almost, okay, now we have new legislation, I can qualify for the second PPP, and then that would probably be a better deal, because it's most likely seems like it's going to be a grant more so than it's going to be, or at least a forgivable loan versus just a straight up loan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. One interesting question I saw here, which I know applies to a decent amount of businesses, is a startup who is pre-revenue but has plenty of staff, so burning money, paying payroll, and they're concerned about the second PPP, that because they're so early stage, they can't show a revenue decline from 2019. And I wanted to ask on their behalf, and on a lot of, say, VC-funded startups' behalf, whether you've heard any rumors, or if there's going to be any concession for companies that may be burning and keeping people on staff, which is kind of the spirit of PPP, but maybe would fall afoul, so to speak, of the technical revenue declines.
I mean, I haven't, I've been trying to follow, you know, the legislation on this pretty closely, and I've seen, you know, various people push back on these revenue decline thresholds. I haven't personally seen
Something like
carve outs for businesses in this situation. I think that in the same way, there were specific mechanisms or rules around startups applying for PPP or new businesses. And hopefully, you know, there would be like a ongoing loss demonstration or something like that. I think that the cynical view of this that would keep it from getting included would be that someone in Congress will probably say, well, we're not going to fund businesses that are just burning money for no reason without making any revenue, and there would be some cynical arguments around that. And, you know, I think this is a big we'll see. Hopefully there can be some, like, what you would like to see, right, is that the revenue threshold is for businesses that have operating X amount of time, and then there's like a much easier threshold to meet for businesses that are newer or something like that. You know? I haven't seen that yet, but I'm hopeful.
And another speculative question, sort of related to both. Has there been anything that you've seen about whether taking an EIDL loan could affect eligibility for second round of PPP?
I don't think I've seen that. No, I think that
They've been distinct to this point, so hopefully they would continue to be distinct.
They have been, which is a little odd in a way, but they have been different. I think that, you know, there was some ideas being floated of not doing PPP 2.0 and doing it through like an expanded EIDL grant system. So like I think there's potential for this to go one way or the other maybe, but I'm not sure. I doubt that taking an EIDL loan, actually I don't want to say that I doubt, but it doesn't seem like yet that would negatively impact you, and it didn't negatively impact you at the initial round, but I don't have anything better to add than that.
Absolutely. Oh, and I want to hit on a point someone specifically asked us, which was after Justin and I's last webinar 3 or 4 weeks ago, we talked about this mechanical issue of the EIDL advance not being forgiven, and that meaning ultimately that many businesses are going to have to repay that small portion, which creates just an administrative difficulty. So we sent a advocacy letter with some of our partners to every U.S. Senate office. And we did receive some responses to that letter. As usual, nothing really tangible. But we did receive responses, so maybe be getting considered in this new package. But that's just one to update the community about that.
Awesome.
Let me see here. I know. Just looking at the questions here. Oh, interesting question for you. So I know you've been doing a lot of these webinars. Have you come across any, what I love the term that the community use, have you come across any PPP loan forgiveness, quote, traps that people are seeing emerge? So basically, have you found or come across any weak points in the existing legislation that if you're in that position, you need to be careful of, or things you identified as weaknesses?
I think one point, one weakness I think in the structure of it itself is around some companies have to pay certain costs like union costs or workers' comp costs that didn't specifically fall into payroll by the definition, or they tried to get it approved and couldn't, and now those businesses are, ended up covering less of their payroll costs, like their all-in payroll costs and others. I think that was kind of an accidental trap of the legislation, but I think I'm doing this just to stall so I can think more of the more arcane traps. I think.
Go ahead.
I think more so there's more of some hacks, I'll say, maybe, instead of like things to avoid, maybe things that I think are smart. I think one could definitely be that applying earlier, so the way the FTE potential safe harbor, like penalty and safe harbor works is that the calculation, they basically say, okay, if you have a 24-week period, you'll take the average amount of FTEs you have versus this reference period, we'll compare them, and if it's less than 100%, then you apply that, 90% is how much you'll get, say. But if you restore the rules, if you restore those employees, even to the, pre-COVID period number, like even if I average less than I used to have, but I get up to that number again by the end of my period, then that's okay. Or if I get to that number by the end of the year even. So people have asked me in previous webinars, like, what happens if I get up to that number, then I stop my forgiveness clock, apply, and then I now have greater flexibility to potentially, I don't have to maintain those FTEs through the end of the year or even through 24 weeks. This isn't obviously always the best case for employees themselves, but as a business owner, this could potentially give you a little bit more flexibility. There is a provision about the 25% reduction in wages or salary rate. You do have to maintain that through the end of the year, I believe. But for the FTEs, it certainly seems like, if you're at this spot where you're like, I've now rehired everyone, I had 10 employees beforehand, I went down to 5, I have 10 now, I don't know what's going to happen the next month. I'm going to apply for forgiveness at 18 weeks and get 100%, and then I'm not going to be penalized if something happens in my business and I have to lay people off afterward.
So to clarify that point, does the FTE period where you need to have restored to 100%, does that end at the end of your the period where you've used the PPP? So let's say you decided to do 8 weeks. Do you need to restore it by the end of 8 weeks, or do you have to do it through whenever you actually make the application for forgiveness?
That's the way I understand it. Yes, it's when like I think outside if you're using the 24-week period, like if you've used your funds in 12 weeks and you apply, then you aren't liable, the way I understand it, for subsequent reductions to FTEs.
Okay. All right, that makes sense.
Now, again, this only works if you get up to that full level again. If you don't get up to that level, then you're still going to have the average calculation that's going to penalize you.
Okay, that makes sense. And
that's so.
Go ahead.
No. So that's it. That's one that I've kind of tossed back and forth with a few people before on webinars. I think just the biggest hack or the biggest recommendation is just like you mentioned first earlier, is document everything and prepare yourself. Kind of don't let anything that, if you're thinking about, do I need this in writing, just get it in writing and maintain your records, and you'll be better off at the end of the day.
And as far as another trap, I think the point that you made earlier about unsecured credit is a significant one. And and you also said how a lot of people would make a dig at loss-making businesses, but when you think about it, economically speaking, when you really zoom out to what the whole point of this program is, it doesn't really matter if a business is losing or making money, because if they're losing money, that money's flowing to someone else, and that's helping the economy. And the same thing with debt, right? It's not like someone who takes out an unsecured debt is doing anything more or less good than a regular debt. So it seems to me, as you said, sort of punitive.
I would agree with that. I definitely think that, like, whether I am making a loss now, but otherwise, if I started in March 15th and I've never made a profit, and haven't made much revenue because I had planned to launch 6 months earlier, and I just happened to launch right at the beginning of COVID. In a normal market, you could argue that business would be making money, and just because they don't have anything to compare in 2019 is irrelevant, But again, I agree with you on that point. I think the unsecured credit one is bad too. I mean, just because it's like, oh yeah, well, we're not, bailing out creditors or something like that. But like, really, if a business owner has to pay, some of these higher interest rate products, especially, it's punitive.
So is that why it's disallowed? Because it's like a moral hazard issue of bailing out lenders?
I don't.
Seems like.
Maybe. I mean, that's one argument. Moral hazard these days is a pretty loose term, but we can save that for a whole separate discussion.
That's true. It's a philosophical webinar. So okay, let's here's a sort of a doom and gloom question, but one that should be covered.
Sure.
So if a business decides to cease operations before the forgiveness application is due, and it hasn't generated revenue, it doesn't have any more employees, and the owner moves on and takes a job somewhere else, does it have to go through the forgiveness process anyway? Or what happens if you cease operations as a business before, during this whole, once you've taken a PPP loan? What happens then? Because that's a lot of people are going to be in that boat.
Yeah, sadly, this is one that I probably need to start learning a little bit more on. I think that my initial take on it is that, if you have, if you don't apply for forgiveness and you have to show to the business, that means that the business has a debt. And that means that you'll have to go into bankruptcy. You can't just close a business with debt. Like the creditors, you have a creditor, the bank that lent you PPP money, and that will need to be discharged in bankruptcy or worked out in some way. So it doesn't matter if you were a sole proprietor that then shut down your business and then took a job. Your sole proprietorship does not technically, you don't have to end it completely. You should still apply for forgiveness. Okay. Because otherwise you're going to end up owing the bank for that money.
And about the bankruptcy, if you're a non-sole proprietor or a regular business and you have this debt on your books, do we expect, and I mean, I know this is speculative from you and I, but do we expect that the government and the SBA would come up with a policy about this? Because we think about it, if there's 3 or 4 million PPP loans, and we know how hard retail and restaurants have suffered, there's going to be, what, hundreds of thousands of closures that many of them would be sort of forced into this bankruptcy process because of the PPP loan. So there's likely got to be something that comes to deal with that. Otherwise, it just seems like a completely overwhelming process for everyone involved.
Yeah, I think I think what will happen is the banks will end up pushing for a resolution that they'll want to get basically made whole on these loans, and that will flow downstream to the borrowers, where they'll say, okay, you filed for bankruptcy, this loan is discharged, but then the banks will go to the SBA or government in general and say, we want to be made whole on these loans that we took on, very quickly to help the economy, and now we're left with all these bad loans, essentially. I could see that happening. I do think that that's going to be a question that the answer to will be very interesting, about how many of those we see.
Yeah. Okay.
How effective was PPP in staving that off versus, the entire small business world? What are the rate of bankruptcies in each? But I think it's a TBD.
Okay. All right. Back to an interesting but a perfunctory question, but a good one is, can I use my loan for paying down personal credit cards that were used for business purchases? So obviously going to fall into other costs.
Yes.
Right? Yes.
Yes, depending on what the costs were.
Yes. Okay. So eligible costs, right?
Eligible costs. Yes.
Yeah.
If you paid your utility bill on your personal credit card, that is a business expense on a forgivable category. The manner in which you pay for these expenses is irrelevant. It's what you spent the money on.
Of course, documentation becomes more of a challenge in such situations. So good thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, theoretically, like if you did that, like, and you did it in basic accounting, you basically have an expense report where you'd reimburse yourself, but that cost would still get booked as a charge, a normal business expense, an operating expense. And whether you paid for it out of a business credit card, your personal credit card, your ACH payment, it doesn't matter, as long as it was an expense for the business in a forgivable category.
Very well. Okay. Good, nice, solid answer. Let's see. Okay, we're jumping in now to the questions that have been asked while we've been on. Let's see here. There's a question asking about this interest on unsecured credit that we've been talking about. So what exactly does that cover? We covered term loans. What about things like credit card debt interest? Especially related to the last question, what if the owner financed something in their personal account, right? So they ran up a credit card debt that then can they not use PPP to pay that off? Is that not eligible anymore?
Say that last section, that last part again. I'm not sure I understood.
So the question is credit card debt eligible, but within that they make the point that what if the borrower used their own credit card, right, to accumulate or to pay off things that then racked up a debt, but it was all business expenses. But so when they go to pay off the interest for that, is that not eligible?
Okay, so that kind of takes us back to the last question of, it doesn't matter for the expense itself, does not matter how you paid for the expense if it's an eligible expense. Let's just say you paid your power bill. You racked up a bunch of these on your personal credit card. Those expenses are still business expenses. Those are forgivable. However, I don't know if the interest on that credit card falls in this. I think it probably would. I'm reading the FAQ. I just pulled it up. And it does not make mention of credit card. It just says unsecured credit. Credit card debt is unsecured credit. So I would imagine that while the expenses you charged, if they're forgivable, would be eligible. The interest would not be. That's my assumption.
That's kind of what I thought too. Okay, another question. Actually, this would be a useful little mini primer we could do. Can we talk about PPP and taxes? So tax eligibility for the forgiveness, and then also any income paid on PPP, is it considered income for IRS tax purposes for an individual? So let's think about it from the business perspective and then the individual's perspective.
Okay, so essentially the PPP acts as other income, and whether I think, it's been phrased a couple ways. You can think of it as these expenses that previously were deductible are no longer deductible if you've had, essentially, if they're forgiven, or you could think of it as other income. The IRS did put guidance out on this, and right now, if you were forgiven a $100,000 loan, whatever the tax rate you pay, you'll essentially be paying that tax rate against that $100,000 if you get the whole loan forgiven. So this acts essentially as an other income stream. This is a point that as soon as the IRS put out this bulletin, I think they did it in early April, people were up in arms and were like, how is this fair to give this out to people that are trying to survive, and then give them this grant and then whack them with taxes on it at the end of the year, especially since it's the government just taking money back that it paid out previously, which not the only time they do that, but it's seems dumb and doesn't seem like is the most friendly to small business owners. But this has not been reversed or clarified further yet. So as of right now, the amount you get forgiven will act as other income essentially for you. And I don't think that matters whether you're filing for the business itself or on your personal tax return with a Schedule C. It will increase your tax bill if you get it forgiven.
All right. Thank you for clarifying that. I know it's on a lot of people's minds. Interesting question. So you said that there was a new safe harbor, and we gave the example of retail businesses or restaurants that can only operate outdoors, so they don't have to return their employment to full spectrum. Does that apply to other areas as well? Like if a business has declined very significantly and they had to shut down parts of the business, and so it's like completely uneconomical to return to full employment, is there a provision for that?
This is where it gets challenging, because if that sounds almost like a very, very open definition where I could argue, well, every business in the country has been faced with second order effects of things, right? For Fundera, right? We even, we work with small businesses and help them get loans, and, we earn revenue from the lender on that, right? And so our business is impacted when all small businesses are impacted, but would we fall under this, for instance? And I think generally the way that I've read it is, and seen it kind of interpreted, is it has to be your business could not operate due to some sort of legal or governmental restriction, meaning
mandated shutdown.
Mandated shutdown or capacity restriction. You don't have to I don't know if it would be a, it would, my business operated from this office park and the whole office building was closed, though I would find that to be a little weird. But if you're a music venue, you can't operate. If you do something maybe tangential to a business that was completely shut down, I'm trying to think of an example, but
like if you're a restaurant vendor at a stadium for live sports or something.
I would think that, yes, that you are definitely impacted. You can't sell there anymore, right? I would argue that. I think the obvious ones are people that operate physical location businesses that couldn't be open and are open less than full capacity. I mean, that's any sort of retail, any sort of, restaurant and bar, a lot of gyms, entertainment, conferences. I mean, it's a good chunk.
Yep.
But like if you're just saying like I have a landscaping business, maybe people cut back on landscaping, maybe they actually increase landscaping. I'm not really sure on that specific use case, but I don't think you could argue that it falls under this. You know?
Okay, I see. There was an interesting question here that I hadn't seen before, which is some people, as you may know, receive PPPs that were significantly smaller than they applied for, or just significantly smaller than their payroll, not 2.5 times. And in such cases, which are a small but significant minority, do you have to return your FTE to its full number as when you applied, or to the number of people that the PPP you got actually covers?
Oh, I have to be honest, I haven't heard that one before.
It was a good question, right? I haven't heard that.
Okay, so when you submit the application originally, there is a number of FTEs that they make you put on there. If the loan ended up being based on significantly less, then I imagine that you should prove that your loan was a smaller amount because you actually only got approved based on a smaller amount of employees, and therefore you should not have to compare apples to oranges in terms of FTE count.
Yep.
I am going to assume that that is going to be a pain in the ass with the bank when you go through to get it forgiven. Like
yeah,
I can't imagine it being any other way. But it seems
sounds
like
difficult. But it was an interesting question. This person said their loan that they got covers 3 full-time equivalent, but when they applied, they had 12, and they could show payroll for it. So
why did they? I guess I'd wonder if there was any other reason or why that happened.
We've seen at COVID Loan Tracker, we've seen a lot of this, like a PPP loan amount that
got smaller amounts.
That's just smaller, or people that got more than they were supposed to, or got multiple. So there's been, and I think some of it might have been clerical, just regular errors or misunderstandings. A lot of this was done quickly. So anyway, I just thought I'd address it.
Yeah, I forgot that, when they released the SBA data, there was a number of companies even listed on the data they published that never applied and were listed on there. And there are reports too, we've heard of, smaller, bigger, where it is just probably a mistake on somebody's end, not the borrower. And
it's a headache in the making.
I think that's why this provision that was being discussed in Congress to, with one signature attestation, right? Like the borrower says, basically attests, I used my funds for forgivable purposes. That's your whole forgiveness. Do that for $150,000 loans and below, and you cover around 85% of all PPP loans. And then a lot of these situations would just go away, and the banks could spend their energy litigating the larger ones that have issues. So it's another reason why that should happen.
Yep. Okay. Well, we've come to the end. I want to say one special thing that is unusual. We had some people join today from the SBA itself. And I want to say a special thank you to those people, because that shows that they're coming to listen to the everyday questions of all the small businesses out there. And we know that they're doing a lot, and obviously it's a difficult situation for everyone, but special thanks to them. And thank you so much for everyone participating. Let's give a virtual round of applause for Justin and all his expertise.
Oh, thank you, Duncan.
And just one last piece. We also have a webinar coming on Thursday. And we're going to send around so we're going to send around the recording of this as well as Justin's deck. And then there'll be an invitation in case you guys are interested in that as well. So thanks, Justin.
Thanks a lot, Duncan.